What's up, guys? Today's YouTube video. I'm going to have to say subscribe 1,000 times. Oh no. Okay. I should get 1,000 subscribers this year because I'm saying subscribe 1,000 times. If I get 1,000 subscribers, I'm gonna say subscribe. Actually, I'm gonna say like 1,000 times, and then I'm gonna say maybe Michael Jackson then 10,000 times. So that's on with the video. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 10. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my. Sub. I'm just gonna say sub. 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 That was my 40th one. Okay. Sub. 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 Sub, sub, 50, sub, 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 60, sub, 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 70 subscribers. I should at least get 70 subscribers. Okay? Okay. Sub, 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 80. Sub, 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 90. Sub, 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 subscribe to Game Everything 100 times. Saying subscribe, just I'm saying sub because subscribe. Okay. Subscribe, subscribe, sub, 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 sub. 110, sub, 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 sub. 120, sub, 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 sub. 130, sub, 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 sub. 140, I think. Also, somebody just kind of opened my door. I think that was my dog, because my dog can open doors. I don't know. Okay, sub, 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 sub. 150, sub, 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 sub. 160, sub, 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 sub. 170, sub, 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 subscribe, 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 sub. 180, sub, 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 sub. 190, sub, 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 sub. 200. I should at least get 200 subscribers in this year. Okay, 200 subscribers, I'll be happy. At least 200. Also, my New Year's resolution was to at least get 100 subscribers. So I hope I get that from saying sub 1,000 times. Okay, or subscribe. Okay, sub, 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 sub. 210. Sub. Oh, also guys, sub means subscribe, just short. Okay, sub, 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 sub. 220. Sub, 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 sub. 230. subscribe, 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 sub, 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 sub. 240. Okay, sub, 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 sub. 250. Sub, 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 sub. 260. Subscribe, 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 sub, 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 sub. 270? I think. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. 280. Sub, 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 sub. Okay. I'm at like 290. Okay. Almost to 300. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. 300. At least get 300 subs. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. 310. Sub, 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 sub. 220. Sub, 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 z. Okay. 220. 230, I think. Okay. Tell me if I'm wrong in the comments. Actually, I don't even think the comments are even on. Sub, 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 sub. 240. If then this at least gets 50 likes, at least I would say Subway 1,000 times. But I have to get at least 50 subscribers and 50 likes on this video. Or maybe 1,000, because this is really hard, guys. Maybe even 2,000. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. 350. Sub, 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 sub. 360. Sub, 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 sub. 370. Sub, 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 sub. 380. Sub, 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 sub. 390. But when I get to 400, I'm gonna just take a breather and tell you something. Okay, guys. Sub, 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 sub. 400. 400. I said sub 400 times. Okay. But I should at least get 1,000 subscribers this year. Or maybe 100. I don't really care. But I am just gonna take a breather just for a second, cause this is super hard. Sub, 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 sub. 410. Sub, 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 sub. 420. Sub, 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 sub. 430 sub 440 sub 450 sub 400 and 460 sub 470 sub 480 sub 490 sub 500 halfway there. I just need to take a breather. 500 times saying sub's not that easy. You know what I need? My headset. Let's put on my headset. Sorry guys, I was kind of blocking the camera, sorry. Okay. Sub 510 510? That's a lot. 510. I'm gonna write that down on a piece of paper. I'm just gonna write down that from now on. Am I still recording? Yeah, okay. Okay, I got the piece of paper. So, cut. Okay. Sub 501 sub 530 sub 540 sub 550 halfway there to 600 sub 560 sub 570 oh. sub 580 sub 590 sub sub, 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 sub. 600. Sub, 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 sub. 610. Sub, 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 sub. 620. Sub, 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 sub. 630. Sub, 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 sub. 640. Sub, 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 sub. 650. This is gonna be like 30 minutes. Sub, 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 sub. 660. Almost 700. Guys, this is the most craziest challenge I've ever done in my life. But I need you guys to subscribe. So then your phone's like this and you need to turn it, and only if you're watching YouTube videos like this. Like this is I'm recording on my phone. But if then I turn it, it's gonna be turned this way. And then you need to just like the video and subscribe, and while you're at it, hit the notification bell to never miss a video. But keep doing it. Sub, 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 sub. 670. Sub, 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 sub. 680. Sub, 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 sub. 690. Sub, 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 sub. 700. We need like a new piece of paper. Look, guys. Actually, you can't really see it, but it's it does I started at 510. Now it's at 700. But I started at 1 all the way to 700. I can keep using this. I got like no pieces of paper on here. Actually I do. Harry Potter notebook. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. 710. Sub, 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 sub. 720. Sub, 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 sub. 730. Sub, 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 sub. 740. Sub, 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 sub. 750. Sub, sub, sub. Sub, 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 sub. 760. Sub, 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 sub. 770. My phone's about to die. Oh no. I went up to click something because I think my phone was going to die soon. No. Well, actually, it said it was 20%, so I'm fine. Okay. Sub, 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 sub. I don't know if I did 780. No, I haven't. Actually, I might have. I don't know. Sub. 790. Oh. Sub. 800. Oh my god. Oh my god. I'm so happy. Okay. Sub. 810. Sub. 820. Sub. 840. Sub. 840. Sub. 850. Sub. 860. Sub. 870. Sub. 880. Sub. 890. Sub. 900. Sub. 910. Sub. 920. Sub. 930. Sub. 940. Sub. 950. Sub. 960. Sub. 970. Sub. 980. Sub. 990. Sub. Subscribe to Game Everything. 900. Actually, not even 900. 1,000. I said subscribe or sub 1,000 times. Then that costed you 1 sub for today's YouTube video. Make sure to leave a like. Oh my god, that was the most craziest challenge. If you like today's YouTube video, just make sure to like the video. But also I might make a channel kind of like this, but I'm gonna post this on my gaming channel. So we're gonna see how it goes, and see you in the next video. Bye.